This video tells the story of Acresford, a hamlet in northwest Leicestershire, through its brewery, mill and church. If it were not for water, Acresford would not exist. The Hooburgh Brook forms the western boundary and, fed by springs, it meanders its way, as it has done through the ages, in a southerly direction before joining the River Mease some 400 metres to the southeast of Netherseal. From ancient times, salt has been a valuable commodity, and tracks made by those transporting it crisscross the country. In olden days, salt was brought from the Cheshire salt mines via the rivers Dove and Trent and unloaded at Walton-on-Trent. Here it was then loaded onto horses to be taken to its destination. For safety reasons, horses and drivers often travelled in convoys. One saltway ran from Walton to Measham, passing through Cotton in the Elms, Grangewood, Netherseal, then crossing the Hooburgh Brook at the ford there and continuing on to Measham. That crossing point was to become Acresford. Over the years, Acresford's association with this old saltway have sadly disappeared. Until around the mid-20th century, Measham Road was called Walton Way. The only reminder now is the semi-detached house called Walton Way Cottage, seen here. Acres probably comes from the Anglo-Saxon Aecer, spelled A-E-C-E-R, which meant a plot of arable land. So in Saxon times, Acresford was a piece of arable land by the ford on which a small settlement most likely stood. By the Middle Ages, the ford was well known to travellers, and these included pilgrims who came to bathe their eyes. The brook was fed by springs whose waters absorbed minerals from the rocks and gravel, and was considered to have medicinal properties which were particularly beneficial to the eyes. It was in the late 18th century that the first accurate map of Derbyshire, which at the time included parts of Leicestershire, was produced. On this extract, although Acresford is not named, it can be readily identified by the convergence of roads in readiness for crossing the ford. There are 3 buildings shown, 2 of which remain today. The first is Cricket's Inn, which was then a coaching house at one end of the Twycross Turnpike, and on that from Burton to Market Bosworth. Today it's a country pub and restaurant. Its name comes neither from the insect nor the game. It probably comes from cricket, meaning a small copse, which would be appropriate as it was opposite the Dumbles, a wooded glade that is still there today. The second is Acresford House, which is a Grade II listed building built shortly before the turn of the 18th century with some 13 acres of land. It was a family house built by William Newbold, a well-known builder who died there in 1798. In 1847, Acresford House came onto the market and was offered for sale by auction at the Cricket's Inn on the 2nd of June. At that time, it was let to George Sutton. Besides showing Acresford House and the adjoining land, the sales plan also showed 2 cottages on the area numbered 12. These still stand and are numbers 34 and 36 Measham Road. Nearby Burton-on-Trent stands in a broad river valley covered with deep layers of sand and gravel, through which water has percolated for thousands of years, depositing a rare mix of minerals, combining to give the beer a dry, slightly sulphurous aroma known as the Burton Snatch. As a result, a thriving brewing industry arose there in the 19th century. In modern times, Acresford residents were reminded of the superabundance of sand and gravel there by the excavations from the quarry on the east, which only ceased in 1976. The geological importance was recognised when it was made a condition of the infilling that the sandstone cliff on the west of the quarry site remained exposed. Living in Woodville, then known as Wooden Box, at the time of the auction sale was John Berry, with his wife and baby daughter. He had some knowledge of the brewing industry as his brother Edmund was a maltster, so he would have been aware that the conditions at Acresford were favourable for brewing. Whether the sale publicity brought Acresford to John Berry's notice isn't known, but he and George Sutton decided to go into partnership and build a brewery in the grounds of Acresford House. Just exactly when it was built isn't known, but it was between 1847 and 1850, since Slater's Derbyshire Directory for 1850 lists under maltsters Bury and Sutton and brewers Acresford. The partnership didn't last long. In early 1852, George Sutton retired from the business, which was then carried on by John Bury on his own. George left Acresford House, into which John Bury and his family then moved. There was a pressing need for a reliable cooper for the cooperage where the beer barrels and casks were made. John Bury was aware of a young man and a cooper in both trade and name. This was Humphrey Cooper, born in Duffield, who was working in Ripley. He was able to persuade Humphrey to join him, and he and his wife moved to nearby Netherseal around 1855. John Bury was a Methodist local preacher in the Ashby de la Zouch Wesleyan circuit, which at the time included Woodville and Swadlincote. He had the reputation of being a somewhat nervous preacher, but nonetheless a very consistent one and of sterling character, although a brewer, wrote one commentator. In the vestry of Acresford Methodist Church is an 1858 preacher's plan for the circuit, which shows him to be number 12 out of 39 on the preacher's list, which puts him among the more senior ones. It is seemingly paradoxical that a Wesleyan local preacher, of all people, was one of those instrumental in establishing the brewery. However, in the late 1840s, the temperance movement and associated bands of hope were yet to gain momentum. When they did, it became clear to John Bury that being a brewer and a Wesleyan local preacher were incompatible. He decided that he had no alternative but to give up the brewery, which he did, and in the mid-1860s became a miller in Colville instead. The brewery was taken over by John Bury's traveller, William Field Cooper, and his brother George. William moved into Acresford House with Humphrey Cooper, his wife, and now 5 children. The business expanded, and agents were employed. Important outlets for the brewery were tied public houses, which were acquired, such as the 4 Counties at No Man's Heath, the Holly Bush at Netherseal, and the Black Horse at Edingale. Eventually the brewery was sold to Sydney Evershed Limited in 1900, which was then taken over in 1905 by Marston Thompson and Evershed Limited. The turn of the century was not a good time for the Burton area brewers. There were too many breweries to service a market which was less than buoyant. Smaller, uncompetitive breweries had to close. This was the fate of Acresford Brewery. Suddenly some 20 or so employees, many of them breadwinners, were without a job and the means to support their families. The situation was viewed with particular concern by another William Cooper, William Gervase Cooper. He had been born at Acresford House in 1869 and lived in the shadow of the brewery for a considerable number of years. He had not followed in his father's footsteps, but had become a baker and grocer with premises in Netherseal. He took the momentous decision to buy the disused brewery together with the land that went with it. The old brewery building would then be converted into a mill where the former workers would be employed. William would have been advised that he didn't have the business experience nor the money and would surely fail. Despite the sound advice, he nonetheless went ahead. The price was £1,450 and the purchase was completed in August 1909. Included in the purchase was Acresford House, the former brewery, land immediately to the east and north, together with the land which would become the quarry. He had only £100 to put down and had to borrow the remaining £1,350, which was secured on the property purchase. This photograph shows Acresford House early in the 20th century. At the front, from left to right, are Humphrey Cooper, William G. Cooper, William's second wife Fanny, and possibly his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Riley. He promptly set about converting the brewery into the mill. At the northern end, the old stores and maltings buildings were demolished and 2 cottages erected at right angles to the row. Spaces in it were allocated for a Methodist church and schoolroom. At the southern end, part was made into a mill office. The remainder was converted into cottages for mill workers. Seen here is part of the former stores and maltings following the conversion. And here is an early picture of the mill, the business of which was initially carried on under the names of Cooper and Harvey. In the wintry scene can be seen the Teagle entrance, the roof cupola, and the entrance pillars. The gates were kept closed one day a year to prevent any legal right across the mill yard being acquired. During the First World War, many men joined up and their wives worked in the mill. They also dug up the space for the weighbridge and learned to drive the Napier lorries. Crucial to the operation of the mill during the war was Samuel Street, seen here at the mill's Teagle door with a sack of flour. He was a faithful and loyal servant of both the mill and the church. Mercifully, the war ended, and there was some modernisation, including a plant for generating electricity. All the cottages were wired, and the occupants paid £1 per week for the electricity supply. This extract from the 1923 Ordnance Survey map, showing the corn mill, the now converted maltings, and storerooms, and the dumbles. The mill produced insufficient corn to meet demand, so supplies were imported, necessitating trips to the ports of Liverpool and Hull, which meant lorries were travelling empty on the outward journey, so the opportunity was taken to make these journeys productive. Transport became an important part of the business, as there was also the need to supply farmers with feed and fertiliser, which were also sold by the mill. This necessitated having only the latest lorries. Most of the inhabitants of the small hamlet grew food in their gardens. Occupants of the 12 cottages had use of plots of land on the lane leading to Donisthorpe, which became known as the allotments. Other needs were supplied by Walter Jones's shop on the then Walton Way. It's not really appreciated just how much space the mill and ancillary buildings actually occupied. This unusual view from the north gives some idea. Following William's death, the business was carried on by his son Willoughby. By now the haulage business was well established, as was a removal side. These were obviously considered to be better prospects than continuing with the mill, so the mill was sold to Staffordshire Farmers Limited in 1949, who continued there until the 1980s. Following the departure of Staffordshire Farmers, the mill stood empty and forlorn whilst the decision was made on its future. Eventually, it was demolished. William Gervase Cooper had a Wesleyan Methodist pedigree of the highest possible order. He could trace it back to Thomas Parsons Slater of Shottle. In about 1770, he became a recognised local preacher, and for nearly 50 years he fervently spread the Christian message, and it was undoubtedly through him more than anyone else that the Derbyshire Methodist Societies were formed. His father, Humphrey, was variously a Wesleyan trustee, a leader, Sunday school superintendent, and one of the mainstays of the society at Oakthorpe, to which place, in his devoted service to God and Methodism, it is said he walked 60,000 miles. In the old church at Oakthorpe, he led the singing on occasions with his flute. He took a major part in the building of the new church. Following the purchase of the former brewery in 1909, William Cooper moved with his second wife Fanny back into Acresford House and was on hand to supervise all the alterations taking place. He selected this portion of the former stores and maltings to house the church and schoolroom or institute for recreation. This spot is easily recognised today. The upper windows have been retained. In 1910, the church was opened and dedicated by Reverend John Denham, the superintendent minister of Woodville and Swadlincote Wesleyan Circuit. Initially, the interior of the church was very basic. Over the next few years, improvements were made. A beautifully carved mahogany pulpit inlaid with fretwork was installed. A fine communion table was bought with money raised by the Sunday school, amongst whose members was Dorothy, William and Fanny's daughter, born in 1910, the year the church opened. The harmonium was replaced by a pipe organ from Gopsall Hall, encased in mahogany to match the pulpit and communion table. The back of the organist's bench was inlaid with fretwork to match that in the pulpit. The northern wall was somewhat bare, And to break this up, William was able to acquire 3 large oil paintings, possibly from Gopsall Hall, at the same time as the organ. They were of the Resurrection, flanked by St. Peter and St. Andrew. A small vestry was added. Over the years, little in it has actually changed, and it's become caught up in a time warp. In 1920, the accommodation in the church was increased by the addition of a balcony at the rear of the church and along the south side. Access to the balconies was gained from stairs outside the main building. These were enclosed to form an entrance vestibule, and a toilet was also installed. God's house was etched above the doorway to emphasize that in the row of houses, this one was different and special because it was occupied by God. During the building of the vestibule, the opportunity was taken to include a plaque as a memorial to those who had died and a celebration of the peace that followed the First World War. Little by little, the wooden forms were replaced by pews, oil lamps by electric lights, and the heating stove removed so that the church finally appeared as we know it today. Unsurprisingly, members of the Cooper family dominated the positions in the church. In this extract from a 1929 preaching plan, we see that William is both a society and chapel steward. Willoughby is the second society steward and Sunday school secretary. Mrs. Cooper is Sunday school superintendent and treasurer, and Dorothy, the daughter, is the foreign missions secretary. In 1927, the small hamlet of Acresford was visited by no less a personage than the president of the Wesleyan Conference, Reverend William Hodson Smith, who had been principal of the National Children's Home for 21 years. He's seen here seated fourth from the left. The photograph, in all likelihood, was taken in the garden of Acresford House. For many years, William had been troubled by the fact that he was heavily reliant on borrowing to run the business, which was secured on mortgages of his company's property, which included the church and schoolroom, which would be sold in the event of default being made in repayment. He decided to transfer the church and schoolroom to Wesleyan trustees, but this was not as straightforward as it first seemed, because the lenders required the indebtedness to be reduced to release the properties from their mortgages. The sum required was £775. Application was made to the Wesleyan Chapel Committee to purchase the church and school. There had been some complex negotiations on the financing, but these left a shortfall of £275, which was covered by a temporary loan from the Midland Bank. The transfer to the trustees was completed on the 15th of December 1931. Interestingly, the conveyance shows access as being from Walton Way. By coincidence, the £775 was paid to the first mortgagees, who were a Mr. and Mrs. Walton. There was an urgent need to raise money to pay off the Midland Bank loan, and plans were immediately put in hand for the Dutch Bazaar. Work started on goods and items for the 8 principal stalls, all to be named after Dutch towns: The Hague, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, Leiden, Delft, Haarlem, and Middelburg. The bazaar was fixed for the 22nd of June 1932. The opening ceremony was at 3 p.m. Prayers were led by Reverend J. H. Dodrell and Reverend D. P. Main, who read from the scriptures. The bazaar was declared open by Mrs. Stanley Turner of Seal Pastures. The spirit of the occasion was readily entered into by those taking part. A special bus was laid on to take those attending to and from Acresford from around the Woodville and Swadlincote circuit. Unsurprisingly for a small church, the Sunday school had never been that large. In 1942 the number was 23. In 1951 the attendance had fallen to just 14. The small number didn't stop the holding of the Sunday school anniversaries with 3 services, or the children playing their part in the Harvest Festival celebrations with baskets of fruit and vegetables. Nor did the numbers prevent the annual Sunday school treat like this one to Alton Towers. William died in 1944. After the funeral service, the coffin was carried by old tenants and members of the firm up the hillside to a corner of one of his fields which had been consecrated as a burial ground. There he was laid to rest alongside the remains of two of his brothers, Samuel and Thomas. Sadly, in this 1969 photograph, we see the burial ground somewhat crudely protected by concrete posts and mesh netting. William's mantle was readily taken on by his widow Fanny, who became society steward, a position which she held until her death in 1974. She was interred in St Matthew's Churchyard, Chilcot. In 1975, there was a symbolic reuniting with William, when his remains were exhumed from the family burial plot in Acresford, cremated, and then buried along with her remains. Following her husband's death in 1986, Mrs. Wickens took on her late husband's role of treasurer. She would drive from her home in Sellyoak to Acresford, a round trip of 60 miles. She would often bring the preacher with her. The group picture here shows Mrs. Wickens, third from the right, in the front row. She passed away in 2002. In the 1990s, the old mill site was tastefully redeveloped. A cul-de-sac was constructed to provide access to 10 new detached houses on the west and north of it. Part of the mill yard became car parking for the church and its neighbours in Brookfield Cottages, as the row of cottages had become known. A children's play area was also constructed. Around 2016, the children's play area was changed into a memorial garden, which has been used by the church for open-air services against the magnificent backdrop of the trees of Acresford House. In 2018, building on the groundwork of Reverend Andrea Sim, who had realised the unique nature of the church, recognition as a Methodist heritage site was obtained. Acresford is one of only two in Leicestershire. Plans were put in force to use its heritage as a tool in mission. A logo was created, which is used for all communications. A simple website was constructed at www.acresfordmethodist.org.uk. Acresford has taken part in Hello Heritage, organised by North West Leicestershire and South Derbyshire District Councils. Acresford, the story of a brewery, a mill and a church, has been written and is supplied free of charge to visitors and interested parties. A flower festival has been organised on the same theme. The heritage has been incorporated into the church sign. Added to its uniqueness is the fact that it is one of those rare places where the fabric between earth and heaven is especially thin, resulting in a special spiritual atmosphere. A strong sense of peace, a strong sense of something mysterious and beautiful, and above all, a powerful feeling of the presence of God. We shouldn't be surprised, for, after all, it is God's house, is it not? The brewery and mill, with the noise and hustle and bustle, have long since gone from Acresford, which is now an extremely pleasant, quiet hamlet. The church, in its emergence from the pandemic, is examining how it may have a new role by combining with the surrounding tranquility to become a centre for prayer and reflection.